Olá, seja bem-vindo ao IoT Journal TV. Sustentabilidade está no alvo de empresas e consumidores em nossos dias, devido às metas governamentais e da sociedade, visando a redução das emissões de carbono para net zero, ou seja, quando se emite uma quantidade menor de carbono do que a consumida, ou mesmo, no melhor dos casos, para emissão zero. Durante a pandemia de Covid-19, houve um aumento de 22 pontos percentuais na importância da sustentabilidade como item crucial na escolha de uma marca pelos compradores, o que agora atinge 55% dos consumidores em geral em todo o planeta. Sobre esse tema, eu conversei com Tyler Schaeffel, gestor global de sustentabilidade na Avery Dennison Smart Track, sobre como a tecnologia RFID pode auxiliar neste cenário. Vamos assistir. So, Tyler, could you explain the concept of the regenerative retail economy and explain why brands should be ready for it?
Sure. No, it's a great question. First off, thanks for having me. So, regenerative, regenerative retail really starts from the word regenerative. And that's a word that's really kind of historically been associated with agriculture, but now we're seeing that kind of transcend into other industries. And regenerative means different things to different people. I generally kind of look at it as part of the circular economy, and it's a systemic approach to economic development, really designing to benefit businesses, societies, and the environment. And it's really in contrast when you look at the take, make, waste, which is a linear model. So a circular economy is generally regenerative by design. It's about kind of decoupling growth from the consumption of finite resources. So when we look at that as it applies to retail, it's really a systemic approach in terms of the materials sourced to make products, and then really the business models that then occur with those products and those retail models. And so the regenerative retail for us, and when I think what you see as an industry, is really creating new products, but also new business models, new consumption models. So as things we'll talk about, I think later today, just around in terms of the proliferation of e-com and things like that, those obviously come with, some negative environmental and sustainability impacts. And so regenerative is about, retailers creating systems that actually reduce carbon, but actually move it from more of a positive standpoint. And so if I look at regenerative, I really look at it like a spectrum. You have sustainability, and then maybe you have net zero, if we're talking climate, and then you have regenerative. And I basically look at sustainability as doing less bad, net zero or neutral is being neutral, of course, and then regenerative is actually being positive. How can I take more plastic out of the ecosystem that I'm putting out there with my retail products, my retail models? And so you've started to see a lot of retailers, if I look at a North America standpoint, you have retailers like Target, Walmart, Starbucks, that are really kind of basing their strategies moving forward as being resource positive, while also being resource positive or regenerative. And I think that's really what you'll see happen more and more.
This is not just a matter of the future. This is right now thing. I mean, it's a problem that we have to solve right now, right?
Correct. Yeah. If you think about, obviously we just had COP26, which is I'll say the premier kind of climate change event globally taking place in Scotland. That really brought, it's further highlighting that this is not something that needs to happen in 10 years, but needs to happen today. And so what are actions that need to happen from an industry perspective, from a government perspective? And not only because, there's climate change, but I think also retailers specifically are seeing that being regenerative, being sustainable is about value creation. I'm selling more products to my consumers because they are overly demanding that. I have a more resilient supply chain. So during COVID-19, the disruptions in the supply chains we've seen, having a more resilient supply chain that's more regenerative, more sustainable has been a positive. So we're seeing also the business benefits come through beyond just being better for the planet or being better for society.
That's good. And Tyler, as far as I know, Avery Dennison has two main visions regarding sustainability. One is the company itself focusing on its own process, and the second is how to bring solutions to help customers become more sustainable. Is it right?
Yeah, I'd say you summed it up perfectly. And, if we look at what we are doing as a company and our vision. It's, to your point, we see ourselves, we're in label and packaging. And so obviously there's a role for us to play as a supplier. And so if our customer has, let's take climate as an example, they have climate goals and waste goals and packaging goals. What we do directly impacts their goals, So can we create products, and we're looking at RFID, products that have lower environmental impact, better production methods, plastic free for the more retail apparel applications. We announced a certification in North America with the How to Recycle group, which is around recyclability of RFID for our RFID paper hang tags. And then there's also the other side of that, and this is obviously, I think, even where we have the biggest potential impact because of where we sit on a variety of our customers' value chains, is that of a solution provider. So us as a supplier, yes, we can have a great impact. If you look at climate, what we do directly impacts our customers, and we recently announced our climate targets have been approved by an organization called Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is, I'll say, kind of the gold standard in terms of climate. So that's us as a supplier. And then the other part where we play a role is as a solution provider. And really, this is where we think we have the biggest impact. And so our solutions help customers measure and validate their emissions. We recently launched earlier this year our connected product called Atma.io, which is, works in conjunction with our physical products to create connected products, and taking that digital ID and making it more powerful. And so what can we do with that? Reducing waste within our customer supply chains, enabling circularity or reuse in terms of packaging, and also enabling circularity in terms of garments within the apparel industry. So there's a lot of other ways I think that we're really starting to do this, and we're also quantifying the impact as well. What is the true measure in which we're able to have? And if we think about our impact, an RFID item, for us represents such a small portion of what it's applied to. So if we can use the technology, the products and solutions that we make to enable these other things that I've mentioned, really that's where we think we have the biggest impact potential. And this kind of represents our, focus on innovation and sustainability to actively remove carbon emissions from our broader supply chain and solutions, but not only our solutions, but our customers' supply chains as well. Just a few, examples. The reusable packaging space, I think, is very interesting for us, and we've got a lot of good examples. But really reducing waste, we have a very keen focus on reducing food waste, which I'll talk about, I think, a little bit later on this call.
And how changes produced by the pandemic, like the growth of e-commerce and retail delivery operations, or the buy online, pick up in store, or new packaging models, can be addressed by Avery Dennison's Smart Track RFID solutions?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of things that have happened for the pandemic that have been accelerated. Obviously, the shift to e-com has already been taking place, but obviously it accelerated during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And also for obvious reasons, that is a good thing because consumers were able to get products while there was inability or intermittences of brick and mortar stores being open or different regional closures and different manufacturing operations. But it's also have had a material impact on sustainability, right? So last mile delivery emissions are expected to jump 30% by 2030. And, online retail is driving that in a big way with 36% of that growth. And there's some other impacts that have happened because more products have shifted online with returns. The rate of returns, you have something in the neighborhood of, returns in store producing less than 10% in terms of waste within landfill. And, e-commerce returns are something like 14% more landfill waste than that. And I think that's because when you buy products online, you don't have the ability to interact with the product. You have fit issues. It also influences consumer behavior. You're more inclined to buy multiple sizes of the same SKU or same type of product, family product, because you can. And so we've seen a lot of other impacts in terms of returns, and there's been multiple impacts with packaging and things like that. And so, RFID being an enabler of omnichannel helps to reduce that. So our solutions, being critical to enabling omnichannel. So rather than shipping from store and having those last mile impacts that you have in terms of delivery impacts, in terms of excess packaging, multiple ship to locations for the same order, and now you can consolidate that from one ship location. So our solutions are helping to mitigate some of those, the landfill increase from items that are getting returned, as well as the issues with products that are just generally being shipped less efficiently, right? So if you can optimize your fulfillment network with using your stores as fulfillment centers, now as opposed to shipping from a DC that's thousands of miles away, as you're shipping from the store that's right down the road. And so although the online ordering is increasing, you're able to mitigate some of those impacts. I think the other big thing we're seeing is just around packaging in general. And so, widely many stories talking about the price of packaging items for transit, so pallets, cartons, things like that. In this country, we saw pallet prices increase by 400%. Part of that was a demand issue, part of that was a supply side issue in terms of not having enough wood and factories being closed and whatnot. But so we're seeing RTIs, or returnable transport items, that are enabled by RFID as being a bridge to manage this material shortage while also increasing efficiencies for our customers as well. Same thing goes with corrugate. You've seen the price of corrugate go up as well. And so, replacing that within food packaging. So we have a big focus on reusable packaging, which, during a pandemic kind of took an unclear path forward because there was a concern around, do I use a reusable package? Is it less safe? But I think largely across the globe, we've seen that, consumers and really governments and industry professionals have become, accustomed that, yes, this makes sense. And in fact, in order to get, there's been quite a few articles written, I think, with how do we kickstart some of these economies that have been closed? And South Korea and the EU have come out and said, we need the circular economy. We need to reuse materials. Obviously, we had very obvious shortages of like personal protective equipment early on and other shortages across the supply chain. So the notion of keeping products in use longer has now become very acceptable, I think.
Yeah, and which companies, or which industries must be impacted by sustainability needs in the first round, and why?
Yeah, I think, if I think about from an industry perspective, the top one that comes to mind for me is food. And food is, for those that aren't aware of food, it is the single largest contributor. The food supply chain is the single largest contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions at 26%. Compare that to other industries like automotive and apparel at 4.2%. It's a big number, right? And food waste alone is, represents, there was a report earlier this year came out by the World Wildlife Fund that says food waste globally accounts for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. Just food that's not created, but food that is created but wasted. And that is a big number when you think about it, especially considering that the number of, populations increase in terms of food insecurity during the pandemic. And it's also a great connection to why we need technology that enable the sustainability of food. Food is the farthest industry in terms of maturity with circular business models at 11% maturity versus something like the CPG industry at 42% maturity. So there's a simultaneously problem happening within the food space that you have a large contributor of greenhouse gas emissions and also a large impact on the planet when you think about food security and things like that, while also at the same time they are not very far along in their journey. So they're not, they're contributing a very negative amount. And on top of that, they don't have the technology, or they're not far along in their technology journey. I'll say they're technological laggards with implementing solutions to kind of reverse some of those impacts. And so I think if we think about food, it's a great place to start. And, I said earlier, we have a big focus on food waste, but there's a very real ROI around solving food waste. That's not just, to, the planet or to society. We think about, making more populations food secure, but, there's an organization in North America called Rfid that found there's a 73 billion net benefit annually with solving food waste. And so there's a very real ROI. And so we're starting to see a lot of investment happen within solving food waste and using really technology to solve that food waste. What kind of digital identity solutions, intelligent packaging can you deploy to solve that?
And the industries, the food industry must know that. They really know that already, or they are aware of that.
I'll say they are. They know. You'll get different answers, I think, to that question. It depends on who you ask. Probably which type of participant along the food value chain. Is it a processor? Is it a retailer? Is it a CPG brand? As well as region. But in general, I'll say that there is a lack of urgency around it because, one, they've lacked the solutions. Two, the food supply chain is complex. But three, I think they've really never truly quantified the problem. And they've only looked at the problem through certain lenses. So there's a lot of activities we're doing to help quantify that problem for a lot of our different food customers, and as well as the food market, because we believe, we can have a material impact with helping to solve some of these challenges. Because, it's what Peter Drucker famously said, you can't manage what you don't measure. And in this case, a lot of the food retailers aren't really measuring. So how can we start to measure? And then they can start to make corrective action to say, okay, now because I've got better visibility to my inventories, I got products expiring, I've got products recalled due to, different issues within the processing centers or in the farm area. Now I can better manage that versus having to remove my whole inventory. So that's where things like RFID and digital identity technology really are going to play a huge role, in my opinion.
And what will lead the demand for sustainability? Consumers' pressure or government legislation? What's the main thing?
I think if you were to ask that question pre-pandemic, you would definitely be more heavily favored towards the consumer end of it. But for obvious reasons, you're seeing the legislation and the regulatory environment really catch up. And I've been involved with supply chain for quite a bit now, and I've never seen so much action around the regulatory environment for sustainability. And there's a lot happening across the board in a number of different ways that is really pushing this. There's a supply chain act within Germany that basically is about transparency within your operations to prevent human rights and environmental abuses. There has been some widely publicized transparency requirements for products coming out of North China throughout the pandemic. You're starting to see legislation within the UK around anti-greenwashing claims. And so how can companies and retailers support their products are sustainable, and they need digital identity technologies to prove the product sustainability and verification? They're doing that through QR codes, through other digital identity technologies. But you also are still seeing the consumers obviously feel very empowered to kind of move this forward. Consumers have increasingly year over year been pushing for more sustainable products. It widely goes without saying that consumers are willing to pay more for products that are sustainable, but it's really gone beyond that to say, I don't even want to say it's sustainable. I want to really see how it's sustainable. And so, something like 88% of consumers want brands to help them live sustainability, but only about 20% of those people know how to check a product's sustainability credentials. So they're really looking for help to say, okay, how is this product sustainable? Can you prove it to me? And so you're seeing, big examples, I think, from brands like Unilever that want to put a carbon footprint of their product across 70,000 SKUs, which when you have a company that size making that kind of statement, I think it really starts to push them, to push the market and push the market forward in kind of a more meaningful way. But it really is, it's all coming back together. And then, because then you have, this legislation in France and places like that around environmental labeling that, starting with the apparel industry and likely moving to others, where requiring brands to communicate the environmental impact of their products, and starting with carbon footprint. And so using technologies like RFID and other digital identities to help verify that and then help communicate that as well. And you'll see that happening with packaging, and there's a lot of legislation around what we call extended producer responsibility, which basically means if you're a producer of packaging or a brand that uses packaging, you can't throw it out. And then even products, you can't throw out products. And so we have 12 states here in the US that are looking at enacting legislation like this. And we have a state like California that's looking at enacting legislation around throwing food out and not being able to throw any food out. And so you're seeing kind of all of these, convergence between the regulatory environment and then the consumer demand, which historically, I think consumers were always first, followed by the regulatory environment. But it's really kind of catching up, and they're really becoming blended in like a meaningful way, and I think a positive way towards sustainability. A professor in grad school that said, if you do the kind of bare minimum of what the government requires, then you're doing the bare minimum. We should be doing beyond that. And that was really kind of where consumers led it. But now it's happening almost simultaneously, where new laws, new legislation, just now within the US, there was an executive order yesterday around being net zero by 2050. So as a country, we're requiring us to be net zero by 2050, which, you wouldn't have seen happen, historically, but now it's just, things are happening at, what would have taken years is really now happening in months, it seems like.
Yeah. And Tyler, my next and final question is a kind of summary of all this conversation. And I saw in one of the Avery Dennison's presentations this sentence: the world is overflowing with waste. And how to combat this problem with Rfid Technologies? This is my question.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I mean, that's inherently a strategic focus of mine, is when we think about what RFID has done historically. We've measured it in terms of inventory accuracy if we look at the adoption within the apparel space. But what we didn't say, but what was happening is we're also reducing waste. If we're able to have a sales uplift, let's say of anywhere from 2 to 13%, a sales uplift anywhere from like 1.5% to 5.5%, while reducing inventories by 2 and 13%. We're obviously within that, reducing the waste within our supply chains where we're sent to landfill. The apparel industry has largely over the years, been looked at as having a lot of waste. And, of the 120 billion garments produced annually, something like 20%, if you look at historical figures, are sent to landfills due to, non-seasonal, doesn't fit, things like that, out of stock. And so I think RFID, foundationally reduces waste. If a product doesn't need to be sold or doesn't need to be made, then all the energy that went into growing the materials for that product, to shipping that product, to housing that product within retail, doesn't need to happen. And so you avoid waste in a material way. And that goes across industries as well. I already mentioned food. The same thing happens with food. If you're able to provide better visibility into food expiration, things like cold chain management, managing product recalls, but then also packaging. We have a strategic focus on, as I said earlier, enabling refillable, reusable packaging, but also using RFID and other technologies to enable the circularity of packaging. So if I'm able to scan a product and identify what it is, I can then say where it needs to go to be recycled. I can extract that value out of it further. That also goes with, keeping primary products in use longer. There's some good examples within the apparel space of, after a consumer is done with a product, scanning its digital ID to say, what value does it have on the resale market? Does it have any? If it does, then where do I send it? If it doesn't, but it could still be recycled, then where do I send it? And so I think if we look at reducing waste, a couple of things need to happen. You need to create the triggers to the products that connect the product to the consumer and then to the cloud. But you also need to create the infrastructure that supports that. And so working with brands and retailers to create these ecosystems that allow for greater levels of circularity. And then ultimately technology is what's going to play a role here. There was a great study done that found that IoT sensors are 77% of executives across US and Europe list those environmental sensors and IoT as having a very important role to play with meeting sustainability goals. And so part of that is reducing waste within operations. And so I think for us, it's about, minimizing products that don't need to be made, keeping products in use longer, and then also, enabling products to find a proper end of life, next step, whether it be recycling, whether it be resale or some other kind of value added process.
E a repórter do IOP Journal, Tatiana Olaya, conversou com a executiva da Avery Dennison, Stefania Bernal, sobre o tema. Vamos acompanhar.
Cuéntanos un poco, por favor, de los casos de éxito en el área de sustentabilidad y que contaron con la tecnología Smart Track Rfid Solutions, por favor.
Sí, claro, mira, tenemos un caso muy interesante en Latinoamérica que se llama, bueno, que la compañía se llama Algramo, quien la desarrolló. Es en Chile, es uno de mis casos de sustentabilidad favoritos porque tiene como dos impactos. Uno es el tema de la economía circular en el aspecto de que los productos estén disponibles para las personas de bajos recursos, es decir, que las personas que cuentan con un presupuesto limitado y no pueden acceder a ciertas marcas porque el empaque o la presentación del empaque no se los permite, o del producto más bien, puedan hacerlo. Ese es uno de los objetivos de Agramo, y el segundo es hacerlo de una manera sustentable, o sea, implementando iniciativas de economía circular. Ya como entrando al tema de la aplicación, consistía en reutilizar envases, hacerlos inteligentes, le llamamos hacerlos inteligentes cuando ya les colocamos un tag desarrollado por nosotros. Y entonces, pues al este envase ya estar conectado, es decir, al ya ser inteligente con un tag de Avery, al tener como posibilidad de entrar a ciertos programas de rellenado o de dispensadores móviles en supermercados, o incluso como en tipo coches o automóviles que iban con los productos de las marcas, daba posibilidad al usuario de dos cosas. Una, reutilizar el envase, lo cual tenía obviamente un impacto en ambiental y en la economía. Y dos, de escoger lo que realmente se tenía que utilizar o se quería utilizar. Es decir, si nomás necesitabas, no sé, 1 kilo de croquetas, pues comprar el kilo de croquetas utilizando el envase en vez de los 2 o 3 kilos que te venden, ¿no? Estoy hablando un ejemplo así burdo porque pues son muchas marcas las que participaron, marcas en limpieza, productos de limpieza, de cuidado del hogar, y también pues marcas para mascotas y otras ahí pues otros productos que justamente incentivaban al usuario a reutilizar el envase, a conectar con la marca. Y también, sabes, algo muy interesante que me pareció es que cuando el usuario participaba en este programa, las marcas generaban como incentivos de lealtad, en donde había como una bonificación en, en el producto para una próxima compra, y también les hacían conciencia de cuánto representaba el hecho de reutilizar el envase, ¿no? O sea, se podían ahorrar 200 litros de agua en esta acción que hacía el consumidor con la marca. Entonces, fue un caso muy lindo acá en Latinoamérica porque puso como en el foco esta realidad que creo que quizás la vemos mucho en Europa o en Estados Unidos, pero en Latinoamérica a veces nos hace ver como esta realidad que ya es posible, o sea, ya es posible tener un consumo más responsable, y sobre todo también un consumo que va dirigido a dos cosas: a cuidar la economía y también a cuidar el medio ambiente.
Hablando de eso, ¿podrías hablarnos para ti, cuáles son los principales desafíos que la región aún necesita vencer cuando hablamos de sustentabilidad?
Sí, sí puedo hablar. Mira, para mí sustentabilidad, y va a estar ligado un poquito al caso de éxito que te mencioné anterior, es una palabra que involucra colaboración. O sea, este caso de éxito no hubiera sido posible sin la tecnología, sin la colaboración de las marcas, y también sin este como enganche o participación del consumidor. Entonces, uno de los retos más tangibles que yo veo en la región es justamente adueñarnos de lo que nos corresponde en la palabra de sustentabilidad. O sea, no es algo que va solamente a corresponder al gobierno o a las marcas, sino a todos los que estamos en el planeta, por así decirlo, y en el proceso de adquisición de productos. Entonces, el hacernos responsables, cada quien en lo que nos toca en la cadena, creo que es algo muy importante, y todavía nos hace ahí falta esa como como integración o como participación formal en realmente comprometernos y colaborar en lo que significa sustentabilidad. Vemos que muchas marcas ahorita tienen objetivos de sustentabilidad y digo, está muy interesante, pero si nosotros como usuarios del producto o como facilitadores de la tecnología o como de estos procesos más amigables, tampoco no participamos, pues aunque las empresas tengan estas metas, pues va a ser complicado como llegar a ellas. Entonces, de las principales cosas sería como responsabilizarnos de lo que nos toca a cada quien, comprometernos por creer que puede ser como una realidad distintas o hábitos distintos de consumo que son posibles y que quizás adoptarlos a un inicio es como complicado, ¿no? O sea, porque obviamente hay esta resistencia al cambio, pero no perder como esa fuerza o esa inquietud de en verdad querer hacer algo distinto, tener productos más sustentables o optimizar mejor nuestros recursos y creer en esta como nueva tendencia que lejos de ser como más un aliado de marketing o algo, es algo que nos involucra a todos como sociedad, como empresa y como gobierno. Entonces, eso creo que sería lo más importante para la región, a mi punto de vista.
Este foi o IOP Journal TV sobre sustentabilidade. Até a próxima.